You know, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Strikes, strikes, strikes. Yes, more industrial action today, but what is the solution? And this against the backdrop of a downgraded GDP growth forecast for next year. We'll get exactly to the bottom of what's going on with that, with a little look at what the IMF actually said yesterday. All that to come after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:30 a.m. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. Now, as Tom was saying, hundreds of thousands of workers are taking part in Walkout Wednesday, the biggest day of industrial action for more than a decade. Teachers belonging to the National Education Union are starting their first day of strikes, leaving 85% of schools fully or partially closed. University lecturers, civil servants, border force officers and security guards are also taking action. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan says a deal with the Teachers' Union is not within sight.
They didn't break down, but they basically said very clearly, look, we can't do anything to stop this strike. This is going ahead on the 1st of February, but we do have 28 days between this and the next strike, so we will continue those discussions. But what we can't do is offer inflation busting, pay rises, because we're really focused on getting inflation down and halving the inflation for everybody, so we all feel better and have more money in our pockets.
Well, bus and train drivers have also walked out today, causing widespread travel disruption. ASLEF General Secretary Mick Whelan is defending the strikes, saying all workers are feeling the cost of living crisis.
At some point, something's got to give. At some point, some form of compromise has to take place. But, you know, we see it's not just rail workers, don't we? We see there's about 1 million people out on strike today, from the civil service to the teachers to the lecturers to all sorts of people all over the place. So, yes, there's a cost of living crisis. All workers are feeling it. And in all sectors, at some point, someone's got to take the shackles off and allow people to talk and make the deals that need to be done for the good of the country.
Well, in other news, UK house prices have fallen for the 5th month in a row, down by 0.6% in December. Nationwide's house price shows the average house is now just over £258,000. Annual house price growth slowed to 1.1% in January. That's compared to 2.8% in December. It comes as the Bank of England is poised to raise interest rates for the 10th consecutive time, adding more pressure on homeowners and buyers. We're on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Back now to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:35 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, first this morning, staff at 150 universities across the UK are beginning 18 days of strike action over pay, conditions and pensions. The University and College Union was offered a more generous pay deal last week for 2023 to 24 worth between 5 and 8%. Yes, 8% pay rises for those on the lowest wages. But the union rejected that deal outright. Well, we can head now to Glasgow University to talk to Mary Senior, the Scotland official at the University and College Union. Mary, thank you so much for making the time for us this morning. Why is 8% too low a pay rise? Seems like quite a generous offer.
Good morning. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that staff in universities, that's lecturers, student support workers, librarians, IT staff, they've seen their pay drop by over 25% since 2009, and we've got inflation in double-digit figures. So, staff want an inflationary pay uplift. And I think the second thing I would say is that for the pay round in which we're in dispute about, which is the 22-23 pay round, the employers have imposed 3% on our members, a 3% uplift, as I say, when inflation is over 10%. Now, you're right to say that the employers did come forward with a new offer last week, and for the vast majority of workers in the sector, that was a 5% offer, but that 5% isn't going to be paid until August 2023. There'd be some amount, I think 2% of it would come forward in February, but the vast majority, the full 5% offer wouldn't be in people's pay packets until August 2023. Well, our members are facing soaring energy bills, food prices that are inflationary right now, so it's very clear why that isn't enough. Plus, the offer from the employers has done nothing to address unsafe workloads, the casual contracts that we see so often in the sector, and pay inequality. So, our members are incredibly frustrated and angry that they don't have a decent pay offer and that all of these other issues haven't been addressed.
You said in your answer there that your members are wanting an inflationary pay increase. And doesn't that get to the nub of it, really? That the government is concerned that if we match exactly inflation this year with pay increases right across the board, that embeds inflation for the long term. That means inflation stays in our system for longer and actually decreases the value of the pay in the first place.
Well, we're in dispute with the university employers. It's the university employers that we are negotiating with. And, our members are struggling right now. Housing costs, energy costs, food costs, fuel costs. Our members, their pay has already lost value by 25% since 2009. So we need the employers to really value the workers in the education sector and give them a decent pay rise, as well as addressing those other issues that I've mentioned, the casual short-term contracts that give our members no job security, the pay inequality, and I should say there's two disputes here. We're also in dispute over pensions and cuts to the pension scheme. Last year the employers forced through cuts to the pension scheme, which means that people are losing 35% of their guaranteed pension income, and this is when the pension scheme we know now is in surplus, so there was absolutely no need for those cuts to go through. So, you know, people are suffering pay cuts now and pension cuts when they retire. We really need to do better for a sector which people like to say is world beating. You know, it clearly can do better.
Why is this strike going on now? Why today? Of course, we heard just yesterday, that GDP growth forecasts have been downgraded, that the economy is this year getting smaller rather than bigger, that there isn't the money to fund these pay increases. Why were these disputes not brought forward earlier? Why now, in concert with so many different other sectors of the economy? Does it not seem like the wrong time to be asking for this, when, frankly, the pot of money is shrinking?
Well, we've been asking for a decent pay rise for a long number of years. Indeed, you know, this dispute has its origins last year. Our members took 3 days of strike action in November, which, you know, as you've indicated, has brought the employers back to the table on pay, and you know they've improved on the 3% pay offer that came forward last year. But we clearly need to do better, and you know, trade unions can't just snap their fingers and take strike action. You know, we had to go through a long balloting period. We then had to give 14 days notice to the employers of the industrial action. So all of those procedures have been through. But I think what I would say is, you know, the university sector across the UK it can do better. You know, we have university vice chancellors and principals, you know, earning £300,000 or more. We know that there are surpluses in universities, particularly in parts of the UK. So, you know, our members, you know, need to pay their bills. They need to meet their bills, and the university sector needs to do better.
Well, Mary Senior, Scotland official at the University and College Union, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Appreciate your time and your thoughts. But what does this mean for students, and what's the impact on their education? Let's now cross to the former head teacher and education consultant Tim Clark, who will be talking exactly about what the impact on students are. I'm afraid we can't cross to him right now. We'll get to him a little bit later in the programme. But moving on. Yesterday, of course, we woke up to news that the UK's growth prospects next year have been downgraded. The lowest in the G7, according to the IMF. The fact that this news coincided with the 3rd anniversary of leaving the EU sent the British media into a tailspin. Claims of Brexit impacts sped far and wide. And an urgent question was called by the Shadow Chancellor. Remainers began praising the IMF, while Brexiteers began slamming this apparently Brexit-bashing institution. But all this commentary was based upon second- or third-hand reports. What did the IMF actually say? Was it in reality all that pessimistic and doom-mongering? Well, let's listen to what Pierre-Olivier Gutierrez, the Director of Research at the IMF, had to say yesterday.
The UK economy has actually done relatively well in last year. We've revised upwards economic growth in the UK to 4.1%. That's a 0.5 percentage point revision, and it's one of the highest growth rates in Europe in that region for that year. It is true that we are expecting a fairly sharp slowdown in this year. We're projecting a growth that is negative 0.6% for the year, and that's a downward revision of 0.9 percentage point. And there are basically 3 things that are behind this downward revision.
Oh, 3 things behind the downward revision, not 1. Well, what might they be? But winding back, it sounded more balanced, even more positive than the newspapers made out, that upwards revision for last year. But surely the IMF's first reason for its weaker 2023 forecast will be to blame Brexit, right? Let's listen in.
First, there is the exposure to natural gas, and we've had a very sharp increase in natural gas prices, energy prices in the UK, and there is a larger share of energy that is coming from natural gas.
Oh, not Brexit. The first reason is that the UK is highly reliant on natural gas, which of course has shot up in price. Unlike other European countries with different infrastructure, the UK generates a huge quantity of our energy with gas and heats most of our homes with that stuff too. So we're disproportionately impacted. That makes sense. What's the second reason then?
Second is that the UK is also, its employment levels have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. So this is a situation where you have a very, very tight labour market, but you have an economy that has not reabsorbed back into employment as many people as it had before. And of course that means there is less output.
Oh, labour market participation has fallen. We know this despite record migration. More people took early retirement in the wake of COVID. The Chancellor was speaking about this last week. It's still not blaming Brexit. Well, surely the third reason will blame Brexit then.
Third is that there is a sharp monetary tightening because inflation has been very elevated. That's a side effect of this high pass-through of energy prices.
OK, so monetary tightening is taking place to deal with that high inflation, mainly caused by high energy prices, as the IMF said. And this affects the UK more due to the structure of our mortgage market, not Brexit. Right. Could there be a fourth reason that finally does blame Brexit for all of our woes?
All these three factors together explain why we have a somewhat sharper adjustment in 2023, but on the back of a relatively stronger growth in 2022.
Oh, that's mightily disappointing. Stronger growth last year than previously thought. And none of the three big reasons as to why this year's growth has been downgraded, none of them are to do with Brexit. Oh, what a shame. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Andrew Lillico, the economist and executive director of Economics, to discuss exactly what this means for the economy more widely. And Andrew, first of all, were you surprised by the IMF's downgrade for our growth prospects in this year?
Well, I wasn't surprised that they downgraded. One of the reasons they themselves had said only a few months ago was for the figures which they had was that the degree of fiscal loosening, quite large degree of fiscal loosening that there was announced in September, which was then reversed, was going to be a reason why the economy might grow a little bit faster than they might otherwise have thought. So with that reverse, then it's no surprise that we get a downgrade. I think that the extent of the downgrade is perhaps a little bit surprising because I think that their figures still rely on the market implied path for interest rates. So the interest rates rising up in the way that people had expected a few months ago. And I think it's pretty clear now that interest rates aren't going to get nearly as high as people expect. So I think that because the interest rates don't get nearly as high, then that will mean that the degree of recession is a bit less.
That is interesting that you pick up upon what the IMF said in the wake of the mini-budget, that fiscal loosening, that stimulus would have had a pro-growth effect. The Rishi Sunak administration reversing those decisions now has a negative effect on growth. But I wonder what this looks like, sort of not just in the next 11 months, but more in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. What are the prospects for the UK economy? What are the long-term factors that might well spur us forward or hold us back?
So I think there's perhaps a contrast between three kinds of things. So one would be that you get the removal of certain headwinds that the UK's economy has faced. So we've had the problems with COVID, obviously. We had the problem with the energy market, and there were some transitional costs associated with leaving the European Union. With those three factors removed from the equation, you should expect growth to be a little bit faster over the next 5 or 10 years than it has been over the past 5 years or so. A second thing is that policy is now likely to change. So in the short term, we're not likely to get any real change in policy because the government abandoned its aspirations that there were a few months ago to have significant supply side reforms. There were supposed to be these 10 areas of supply side reforms that the Truss administration was going to announce. Basically, for political reasons, the government has abandoned all of that. Didn't seem to be feasible to it. So that means that relatively little will happen in the next couple of years. When the Labour Party wins, as presumably they will in 2024, they'll then introduce a series of changes to the economy, and it's unknown to what extent those might lead to a growth boost or some growth reduction. So that's a kind of area of uncertainty which might go either way. A third factor is that I think that over the next 5 or 10 years, we should expect that a number of technological shifts, which have been perhaps hanging around, waiting, not quite arrived for a few years and talked about, may well come to maturity. And if those technological changes start to bite, then we could expect there to be some growth boost from those. So put together, I think that there's some reasonable, there's some hope over the medium term, but things are obviously a bit dicey in the short term.
No, that's really, really interesting. Looking forward, sort of the structural things about the UK economy. It may well look a bit more rosy than things look right now. I want to turn briefly to inflation, of course, because this is one of the big points that the IMF pointed to, particularly in how it must be dealt with interest rate rises being a bit of a knock on UK growth. The growth of the money supply in this country has been an interesting thing to watch. And I think you've provided us with a graph that people watching on television can see now. The growth of the money supply as it went there. And we can see this enormous boon during COVID of just the amount of money that has been created. And I suppose your argument is surely that has had an inflationary impact.
Absolutely. So I'm the chair of the Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. And one thing that the Shadow Monetary Policy Committee warned about, so a number of members of the committee are perhaps rather more interested in monetary growth statistics as in the case of inflation than some other economists. And one of the things that we warned about from early 2021 was that very large spike that you can see there in money growth, going above 15% at one point in early 2021, was liable to lead to inflation. The monetary authorities rather overcooked things on the money supply side late in the COVID period. They kept the growth going perhaps a little bit longer than was really necessary. It's easy to blame people with the benefit of hindsight, of course, but I think that some of us had warned about that even at the time. But and I think that was a key factor with the rise in inflation, underlying inflation. So that would probably get us to 6-7% inflation. Of course, on top of that, there was then the energy cost consequence. But that's one factor. Now,
just to interrupt you for a second. I'm sorry to do this because we are pressed for time. There is the argument that people say we've been doing quantitative easing for ages, since the global financial crisis. We've been printing all of this money and it didn't have an inflationary effect. I suppose your argument with that graph there is that the amount of money printing that was going on was just on a different level before COVID compared to what we did during COVID.
So quite a lot that there was, well, absolutely. My view would be that those monetary statistics, whether you think that it's quantitative easing or whatever other reason it is, the underlying result was that we had very rapid monetary growth, and now we've got very slow monetary growth, below 3%. And the consequence of that is likely to be that even if we didn't have significant further interest rate rises, inflation will come right down. And so the talk that we were going to get to 5-6% interest rates at peak, I think was well wide of the mark. In fact, I think that was clearly wide of the mark even a few months ago. And the Monetary Policy Committee, in fact, voted for no further rate rises. I voted for a quarter-point rise, but even I didn't think they were likely to go up by very much more. So I think that people are still, even though interest rate expectations have come down a lot, I think that they may still be expecting a little bit more than's actually going to happen. I think we could be quite near the peak now.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for that analysis. It is genuinely fascinating and hopefully very, very informative for people in terms of what's going on with the wider economy. Now, we just have time on the show. I mentioned a little bit earlier in the programme we're going to speak to this head teacher, education consultant Tim Clark, because the effects on students is really, really large in terms of what's going on with all of this strike action. Tim, what's your impression of what children are going to be facing across these days of strikes?
Morning, Tom. Well, obviously, anything that closes schools and impacts on children's education is worrying and should be avoided at all costs, particularly, I think, coming so soon after the disruption of COVID. And we know that when schools close, it's the most disadvantaged, the most vulnerable kids that suffer the most. And I think an aside here is that the teachers are at risk of damaging their reputation. I think during COVID, the standing of teachers, the status of teachers grew tremendously as parents struggled with home tuition. They realised just how difficult teaching is as a job to keep kids motivated and engaged. And I think if parents are taking time off work or they're turfing kids out on the streets, then teachers run the risk of losing that respect that they've recently earned. But I do have to say, Tom, and for me, this is the biggest worry with the strike. Now, the headline is the strike. Teachers are on strike, schools are closed. But what we must not do is lose sight of what lies behind this strike. It's not just about money. I'd say for the majority of teachers, bearing in mind the majority of teachers didn't even take part in the ballot, let alone vote for strike action. Some of those issues, such as the teacher recruitment and retention crisis that this country is now facing, if those issues are not solved, then within the next 2 or 3 years, we are going to find something far more serious than a few days of teacher strikes. The strikes are unfortunate. I wish they didn't happen. I hope there's no more. But we could end up in a few years' time of finding heads sending kids home, not because the teachers are on strike, but simply because the head has not got enough staff to run the school.
Tim, I'm so glad that we were able to fit you in just at the end of this show, because that is such an important point to make, and I'm very, very pleased that you've been able to make it. Of course, this retention issue is huge. I myself come from a family of educators. My mum is a teacher, and my goodness me, the amount of workload that is so much pressuring, and sometimes it's more than the pay, the sort of the form filling and keeping up with all those lessons plans. Such an important element to all of this.
I have yet to go into a staff room in my job now as a consultant. I gave up being a head a couple of years ago after 18 years. But as I go around the country visiting schools, I have yet to find a school where staff are moaning about salary. They are moaning about other things, such as a lack of legal protection, about poor behaviour, about workload.
Yes.
And
Tim, I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme now, but thank you so much for your
profession within 4 years.
Tim, we are at the end of the programme, but thank you so much for your contribution. Really, really appreciate it. That's it for us today. Thanks for sticking with us here on The Briefing. Up next, it's Bev Turner. I'll be back at 9:30 tomorrow.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you.
GB News will always stay honest, balanced and